Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story is the next installment in the incredible series by Jack LaFountain. As ever, please do let me know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag Team Fear and DMT's Cryptid crew. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story, entitled Death Rides the Red. Let's get straight into that. Virginia. Nick was hungry and dog-tired. He hadn't eaten since they left the lines around Petersburg. He had slept precious little to boot, and he had to keep moving and keep his men moving. The remnant of the regiment started out following along the line of General Kershaw's strung-out troops, moving away from Petersburg. Somewhere along the way, they took a wrong turn and found themselves lost near Sailor's Creek. Nick constantly reminded the men that there were rations waiting for them up ahead, mixing the incentive to move with barked commands for the men to close ranks and press on. When the men played out and half-starved, but they obeyed. Nick was determined not to let his men fall into the hands of the Yankees. They waded across Sailor's Creek and pushed beyond the Deaconsville Road, and suddenly blue-clad cavalry appeared in front of them. Stragglers running up from behind reported Union infantry closing from that direction as well. They were surrounded. Nick drew the men close and ordered them to lie down in a depression a little way off the road in hopes the Yankees would pass without seeing them. There was going to be a fight once the Confederates were pressed into a small enough area, and panic was nipping at his heart and threatening to swallow him up. "Where's Jack?" he thought. "God, where's Jack?" Cannon rumbled to the north of their position. The staccato of small arms erupted in front of them as retreating troops slowed and bunched up on the Deaconsville Road. The sound was echoed behind them in the east. "Steady, boys," Nick yelled. "Hold your fire." In answer to Nick's prayers, Jack rode out at a thundering artillery battle towards the huddled group of frightened men. Their courage surged when he appeared and they raised a cheer. Nick breathed again, glad to be relieved of command. A volley of musket fire ripped the air above Nick's head and thudded into the approaching rider. Jack's horse tumbled headlong to the ground and Jack disappeared into a swirling mass of arms, legs, and dust. "No!" Nick cried and ordered the men to return fire. The troops rose from their hiding place and loosed a volley at the slowly advancing Yankees. Jack separated himself from the dying horse and crawled across the road to Nick's side. "Boys, we're surrounded, but we ain't gonna surrender. Y'all hear me? We ain't surrendering. We're fighting our way out of here." Jack hollered over the sound of battle. The men nodded a grim assent. "Lieutenant, I ain't got no ammunition," one private said. And Jack laughed, slapped the private on the shoulder and said, "Hell, Johnny, me neither. Fix bayonets." Jack quickly scavenged a rifle from one of the dead and followed his own command. "Stay close to me and keep moving. No matter what, everyone keep moving. Stragglers are dead men or Yankee prisoners. Y'all want to lose your heads and be strung over one of them fences? Just let the Yankees get you. Y'all can bet your sweet ass they'd like to get their hands on those moon patches. Okay, Nick, you got drag," Jack commanded. The men ripped the round white patches from their uniforms or ditched their blouses altogether. They had no intention of surrendering, but neither did they want their body abused. They would follow orders for now. Jack stood up into the oncoming fire, and everyone else followed suit. Next to Nick, Dan Avery fell dead, a huge hole in his forehead. Brain splatter across Nick's face. Blood filled Nick's eyes. "Charge!" Jack screamed. Nick snapped bolt upright, instantly awake and gasping in ragged, shallow breaths. Jack still slept undisturbed near the fire. It took Nick a moment to orient himself. He was no longer in Virginia. He was at Nate Carson's place. He mopped the cold sweat from his brow and arms. "That's good," he whispered to himself. "Yeah, that's real good." He eased gently back onto his bedroll, and though his eyes stayed open for hours, he never saw his host watching from the bedroom door. Texas. Nate threw his saddle across Lil Joe's back. Lil Joe was Nate's pride and joy. He was born and bred on the Lazy L during Nate's first year in Texas. Lil Joe was powerfully built, stood 18 hands, and had the smoothest gait in Texas. Nate loved the big horse, and he returned his affection. The black nickered as Nate drew the cinch tight. He gave Nate a gentle nudge. "Good boy," Nate whispered, and gave Joe's broad neck a pat before swinging up into the saddle. It was 10 miles from the Lazy L into Texoma. Nate turned southeast out of the Lazy L. About half a mile from his house, the road forked east to Texoma and southwest to Whitesboro. Nate took the Texoma fork and rode along the boundary of his old friend's ranch. Nate's night had been dreamless, and he was mindful to thank a merciful God for simple favors. For 2 years, he'd managed to keep his memory of Gettysburg buried in the past. Thank God he'd escaped only for a single night. The morning air was cool, clean, and overflowing with sunshine. A pair of angrily chattering squirrels tumbled on the road, rolled for a moment in a tight ball of fur and dust, and chased one another across and up a nearby hackberry tree, oblivious to the approaching horse and rider. The excited chatter continued as they barked at each other from distant branches above Nate. It was one of those rare Texas days when the heat and humidity of summer was fading and the bone-chilling winds of winter had not yet arrived. The autumn sun brought out the songbirds that filled the air with intoxicating melodies. Life was as God had meant it to be. A man needed only to sit back and enjoy the wonder of it all. Nate felt at ease for the first time in days. The solitary ride lifted Nate's spirits, and he found himself whistling a happy tune about yellow roses. Nate had yet to see a yellow rose in Texas, but no matter. It was a beautiful morning and a cheerful tune. The town of Texoma had half a dozen streets from which the dust blew back and forth in summer and turned into quagmires in the winter. The 20 or so houses that made up the town were about equally divided between the well-kempt and tumble-down. Most of the latter were the property of cowhands, like Luke Pennington, who worked on the ranches that surrounded the town. There were 6 businesses along the main street of Texoma: Ferguson's Dry Goods and Post Office, the Lone Star Saloon, the Sheriff's Office, Pendergrass Livery, the Bank of Texas, and J.M. Wentworth, undertaker. The freed slaves who weren't trying to scratch out an existence sharecropping added cobbled together bits and pieces of wood and canvas into a shanty town about a quarter mile east of Texoma proper. And like most Southerners, Nates never owned slaves and had little to do with them. They were simply a fact of life in a society that was very resistant to change. Southern society had little to no tolerance for upward social mobility among its citizens, regardless of color. It had always been that way, and folks found it hard to believe it could be otherwise. The entry into that society of freed black slaves as citizens was beyond the imaginative powers of most Southerners. The war brought freedom to the slaves and laws calling for equality. Reconstruction was aimed at making it a reality. The Republicans in Congress thought making equality more real in the South than it ever would have been in the North a punishment for rebellion. They amended the Constitution to proclaim the black man an equal and threw him into a society that never really knew equality. Neither law nor Yankee guns could make former slave owners accept Negroes as citizens or concede them a living. Nate wasn't sure if the anemic freedom lived out in one of those squalid one-room shacks was better than slaving on one of the ranches or farms along the Red River. But he genuinely hoped it was. Nate decided his first stop in town ought to be to visit the undertaker. Nate believed that If ever a person was born to be an undertaker, Jeremy Miles Wentworth was the man. After a dozen summers in the North Texas sun, Wentworth maintained the same chalky pallor he brought with him from his native England. Wentworth stood over 6 feet tall, weighed in at about 175 pounds and was all angles and loose, free-swinging joints. He was easily recognizable on the street by his ever-present black derby and twirling cane. The townsfolk avoided him whenever they could, but he was not so squeamish. He walked with death for years. They were old acquaintances, if not fast friends. The Englishman had a sharp mind and a dry sense of humor Nate found refreshing. And on his few excursions into Texoma, Nate would often drop by to see the Undertaker for a game of chess. This trip, he invited Wentworth to join him at the Lone Star. Nate thought Wentworth's general want of company combined with a few beers ought to be enough primer to loosen some information. And Nate and his guests found an isolated table near the rear of the saloon. "I know what you're up to, old chap," Wentworth said as they were seated. "Oh, how's that?" "You're after information. Information that's been kept away from the town. You think beer and our acquaintance will get for you." Jeremy, how many times do I have to tell you? You're never going to get along with folks around here until you stop being so direct. "Yes, I suppose you're right. Of course," Wentworth conceded. "Look, Jeremy, your customers ain't going nowhere without you. Here's what you do. Relax, drink a beer or two, and then you hinted it a little before you let on that you know what I want. But since you brought it up, tell me about John and Henry Hotchkiss. How did they die?" "And why should I tell you? No one else has managed to pry that information loose except Sheriff Bryan. Why you?" "There are several reasons. First, because I got a stake in this. I'm Sam's best suspect, and I got the feeling you've been wondering about me yourself. I'd like to change that." And Nate lifted his hand and counted off the reasons on his fingers. "Secondly, I know something strange has happened here. Sam Bryan's already told me he hasn't seen anything like this, and I'd bet the farm you haven't either. Third, if I killed them, I wouldn't need to ask about it. And finally, contrary to what the sheriff thinks, I have seen it before." Now Wentworth looked hard into Nate's eyes, searched his face and posture for deceit or insecurity, and found none. He gave a slight shrug of his shoulders and leaned back into his chair. "Very well then." And he took a sip of the beer. "But you shouldn't be so eager to wager your home. Wentworths have been in this business for more than 100 years. What I've seen and know might surprise even you. And since you are ready to risk so much for the truth, I'll tell you. Henry and John Hotchkiss had their throats ripped open. Not cut, by the by, but torn. The jugulars and trachea of both men had been roughly severed in a distinctive pattern not unlike teeth. John was nearly decapitated. The bodies had been nearly emptied of blood. The wrists and ankles bled hardly at all. I'd say the wounds were opened by struggling against the ropes that held them in their chairs, and by the look of the deep abrasions, they had been tied for quite some time before they were killed. No weapon was found anywhere on the place that would make such wounds, and I doubt one exists. Does that sound familiar to you now?" Yes, it does." Nate's reply raised Wentworth's woolly eyebrows in amazement. The Undertaker leaned in close and lowered his voice. "There's a word for this kind of murder. I'm going to say it once, and I mean once. You will not get me to repeat it to Sam Bryan or anyone else for that matter. Do you understand?" Wentworth asked. "I'll save you the trouble. The word is werewolf," Nate whispered. Wentworth nodded. "But you heard no such nonsense from me," he said. "Jeremy, you never cease to amaze me." "I feel the same way about you. Another round?" "Now, A broad smile lit Nate's face. You're getting the hang of Southern conversation. Chet Ferguson, storekeeper and local postmaster, needed no primer to spill the latest gossip. His store practically ran on telling of tales. Unfortunately for Nate, Chet's news was third or more likely fourth hand. The telling grew more dramatic and less credible with each retelling. In Ferguson had the bodies hung from their rafters, throats cut and bodies dismembered. Ferguson maintained the house had been ransacked and Hotchkiss robbed of everything he owned. And Ferguson was sure it had been Indians. "I done it for the whiskey," Ferguson asserted. Nate was hesitant about calling on the sheriff. It was a bit like charging entrenched infantry, which meant it had to be done, but who the hell wants to do it? As he suspected, Sheriff Bryan was more reliable than Ferguson and less informed than Wentworth. Bryan was still playing his cards close to his chest. Jack was right, of course. Bryan considered Nate a suspect from the start and plainly said so. The sheriff had also changed his mind and told Nate as much. "What changed your mind, Sheriff?" Nate asked. "Wentworth told me they were tied up before they died. It just doesn't fit you." "Thanks, I guess. What does fit?" "Somebody looking for something," Sam said. "Whoever did it either wanted to find something John had hidden. I think it's more likely, though, that someone tried to beat a secret out of him." "I don't picture that tactic working with John Hotchkiss," Nate said. "Neither do I. I couldn't picture you trying it either, but I suspect that's why and how he died. What troubles me is why I butchered him like that." Bryan asked. "That keeps eating at me. That old man will give a stranger the shirt off of his back. Why the hell did they butcher him?" "They? You think more than one person was involved?" "Might near had to be," Sam began. "Henry sent the hands from the town home the afternoon before and told him to check in around mid-morning to see if supplies arrived. When they were leaving, not one of the hands saw anybody who didn't belong there. That means the killer probably hadn't got there yet. I think the two of them were taken together at home sometime later in the evening. I don't see one man being able to do that and managing to tie them both without help. I suppose it is possible, but it ain't likely. The killing wasn't quick or quiet. Then there's the two missing cowhands. I'm certain those cowboys had to have been disposed of before John and Henry were killed. It's too big of a job for one man." "If the house was ransacked, was it robbery? Indians?" "Nate, you shouldn't listen to Chet Ferguson. John never kept much money on the place. If robbery was the motive, why not just shoot him and be done with it? No, it wasn't a robbery. We'll know for sure soon enough. John Jr. is supposed to be here today or tomorrow. You could bet your ass John Jr. will know if anything's missing. I'm glad I won't have to show the Congressman those bodies." "Sam, has anybody been nosing around town, asking about John's whiskey making?" "Not that I heard. Why?" "Well, I heard the other day a couple of whiskey runners were killed over in Whitesboro. I heard the bodies were on a pretty sight too. Reckon there's a connection?" "You're damn near a hermit, Nate. Now where in the world would you hear such a thing?" "Let's just say it blew in on the wind. You gonna check into it?" "I might just as well. Sounds a bit far afield to me, but right now it's all I've got." Nate found little more than wild rumor and speculation over the rest of the town. Most people liked Ferguson's idea that Indians were to blame. Who else could do such a thing? No strangers had been seen in town before the murder. None had shown up in town since. It had to be Indians. Nate nudged little Joe west towards home. The sun was a trifle past overhead by then, sending down an unseasonable warmth. The sights and sounds along the way home told Nate it was still a beautiful day, but there was no whistling on the ride home. An hour before dawn, a dreamless sleep claimed Nick Corbin. Nate was already on the road to Texoma when Jack prodded Nick's shoulder with the toe of his boot. "Get up. You're going to sleep all day," Jack said. Nick peered up at him with bloodshot eyes and gave Jack a weak smile. Maybe. Thought I'd try and get an hour or two anyway." Nick's eyes felt full of sand and his body creaked in protest when he rose to his feet. He took the mug of coffee Jack offered. Jack knew only too well the source of Nick's insomnia. He had been there himself, and the morning after was worse than any hangover. Jimmy put biscuits and bacon on the table and watched as the other two men ate in silence. The leftovers were stuffed into saddlebags and one last cup of coffee was poured before Jack and Nick headed for the barn and their mission on the Rockin' H. "Bad one?" Jack finally asked. Same one," Nick said. Jack nodded. Sailor's Creek. There'd been many times before. It was one of many battlefields that floated uninvited through their dreams, and one which haunted Nick the most. Jack shared Nick's hope that when the chaos let loose at Sailor's Creek was finally laid to rest, they would both sleep better. The two men saddled their horses and started north towards the Red River. Once they crossed the river into Indian territory, they turned east and rode along the bank towards Colbert's Ferry. The first section of land on the south bank belonged to Nate. The Rockin' H ran along the river and the rest of the way to Colbert's Ferry. Jack and Nick planned to ride along the river until they reached the ferry. If they found nothing of interest along the banks of the river, they would cross over onto the Rockin' H land. While in Indian territory, the status as government agents should get them by the army or the Chickasaw Light Horse Police. Jack was hoping it wouldn't come to that. They had every right to be anywhere in their tribal area that they wanted to be. They also had a reputation for trouble. It was also the matter of dead Tennessee sheriff that the law had questions about. He thought their story about being out for a ride sounded weak. The chances of the story standing up under serious scrutiny was only fair to middling at best. On the Texas side of the river, the chances were even worse. A mile and a half down the river, they happened upon stacked piles of oak logs over the Texas side, and from somewhere beyond their line of sight came the distinctive sound of an axe meeting a tree. They reined in amid a stand of cottonwoods and sat listening. Jack fished a double eagle from his pocket. "Loser climbs," he announced. "Heads," Nick said. "Ain't your day, Nick." He showed Nick the coin and handed him the leather case strapped to his saddle. Nick pulled the case's strap over his shoulder and handed his reins to Jack. He moved his horse closer to the tall cottonwood and stood in the saddle. And with practiced moves, Nick shimmied up the tree and found a suitable perch. He pulled the large field glass from the case and scanned in the direction of the woodcutters. "You see anything?" Jack asked. "Not nearly enough. I don't reckon going any higher is going to help. They're behind the crest of that hill." "Come on down then." Nick secured the glasses and cautiously picked his way down the tree. "Now, who do you suppose is clearing land that days ago was a murder scene and has since become the property of the Congressman?" It does make you wonder, don't it? Nick smiled for the first time that day. "Your call, Nick. Play it safe and dry or go for a swim." "We won't get close with the horses. Let's swim." And Jack and Nick tied up their horses in a small clearing, 20 or 30 yards north of the river. They returned to the riverbank and stripped off their boots and clothes, which were tied up in oilcloth, in case they were of need on the far shore. The naked men slipped into the muddy water, and Nick was still cursing his luck. In many places, the Red River could be waded, but not here. The river was deep and starting to move fast where they chose to cross. Jack and Nick were both strong swimmers. They battled the current with powerful kicks kept under the surface to keep from splashing. Once across, they shook the water from themselves like a pair of wet coonhounds. The ground rose gently from the river for a quarter mile before breaking into waves of hills rolling off to the south. The riverbank was lined with cottonwoods and willows, but beyond the trees and stacked logs, their only cover was tall grass and grazing cattle. They broke the cover of the trees and jogged up the hill. Near the top, they dropped down to a crawl for a peek over the crest of the hill. Jack trained a small field glass on a group of men at the foot of the hill. Half a dozen white men were watching a crew of Negroes clearing trees along the track of the new wagon road. A new building was going up on Hotchkiss's land. It was tucked smartly away in the surrounding oaks and hackberries that filled a depression in the rolling hills. A camp for the work crew was set up in a nearby clearing. "I'd say they were planning to stay a spell," Nick said. "It looks that way," Jack answered. "I don't see any familiar faces. Do you?" "No. Wanna bet a congressman knows all about this project?" "I don't believe I would bet against that. It's hard to believe a man, even a Republican congressman, would kill his father and brother. Then again, it's hard to think that these boys are out here up to God knows what, days after the murder, and he doesn't even know about it." Jack nodded in agreement and returned the glass to its case. "Let's get out of here," he said to Nick. Nick reined Lil Joe in before the ironwork gate that stood across the road leading to the Rocking H Ranch. The twisted wrought iron rose from either side of the road and met at a large H over the rocking bar about 10 feet above the road. The gate looked the same as it always did, and beyond it, the grass-covered hills and the oak trees lining the way looked the same. Nate's gut feeling said that it was an illusion. The Rocking H had changed in a way more fundamental than the two new gravestones on the hill. The place wore an eerie, unsettled feel that made Nate's skin crawl. There was something unseen that moved behind the hills, the trees, and the grass. Something evil. Whatever watched him ride away from John's funeral a few days earlier still lurked there. Let's go have a look, Joe," he said and nudged the big horse. Lil Joe wheeled towards the Rocking H. As they passed under the gateway, Nate caught the sound of approaching horses from the direction of the ranch house. He brought Joe to a stop and waited to see who showed up. The answer came as a surprise. A sleek black coach topped the small hill ahead of him. The lavish rig was flanked by 4 outriders carrying scatterguns across their laps. It was too much show for anyone in Texoma. "That's gotta be John Jr.," Nate told himself. The procession came to a halt when it reached the place where Nate waited. Nate touched the brim of his hat in welcome and slowly walked Lil Joe towards the coach. The riders raised their weapons and 2 of the men, riding drag, moved up alongside the rig. "It's okay," a voice from inside the coach said. A hand waved Nate closer, and Nate continued forward. In the driver's seat sat a stone-faced Negro that had to be one of the biggest men Nate had ever seen. He sat ramrod straight in the seat, following Nate with only his eyes. Nate moved Lil Joe up alongside the carriage. The outriders eyed Nate with the same cold, undisguised hatred and stony faces the driver employed. Nate nodded at each one as he passed and bent to look in at the passengers. Congressman John Hotchkiss Jr. definitely bore the physical stamp of his father. Like the senior Hotchkiss, Jr. had close-cropped sandy hair, and his beard showed just a hint of red. He had hazel eyes that sparkled with life from behind the wire-rimmed glasses that perched on the bridge of his long, pointed beak of a nose. There, the similarities ended. Young Hotchkiss lacked the leather complexion his father earned from years in the North Texas sun. The father radiated inner strength and confidence that were lacking in the son. John Jr. was a manipulator. He was a skilled organizer who got things done, but he was a user of men, not a leader as his father had been. The eldest Hotchkiss son had been his mother's favorite. Hotchkiss raised his namesake to be a rancher, though it was clear early on his heart was not in it. At 16, Hotchkiss dragged the boy along to chase a band of rustlers who had made off with a dozen Rocking H steers. The boy was shot through the thigh. No bones were broken, and the bleeding quickly controlled. And Hotchkiss retrieved his cattle and carried his wounded son home. From the moment they arrived, Anna Hotchkiss took over John's recovery and absolutely forbid his involvement in any further ranch operations. Before her death a year later, she extracted from her husband the promise that John was to be sent east to law school. And true to his word, after Anna's funeral, John Hotchkiss sent his eldest son to Memphis to study law. And 2 years later, secession fever griped the South. And when Texas succeeded, John returned home and found employment at the capital in Austin. During trips from the capital, John Jr. set up a private law practice in Whitesboro. The young Hotchkiss saw no future in the Confederacy. Like many along the Red River, he had voted against secession. However, once secession became a reality, he chose to make the best of it, and he became an aide to Franklin Sexton when Sexton won a seat in the Confederate House of Representatives. When the war ended, John returned home and, to his father's horror, embraced the Reconstruction. And in 1870, he went to Washington as a Republican from Texas. And John Hotchkiss Jr. was as stern and austere as any New England Yankee when it came to business. There was a fortune to be made in the reconstruction of the South, and Hotchkiss meant to be the one making it. Folks around Texoma said that the only local development Hotchkiss brought to this district in Texas was the development of John Hotchkiss. And from his committee seat, he voted more than once to keep troops in the South. Troops whom he saw to it were fed Hotchkiss beef and garrisoned on Hotchkiss holdings. If John was a hollow reflection of his father, the man sitting beside the Congressman was another story altogether. Nate was certain this man's appearance fit his life. He was tall and angular with sharp eyes and a vicious face of a rabid dog. His eyes and hair were coal black. A jagged white scar jumped from a dark skin and ran from beside his left eye to his chin. His hands, like his face, were rough and tanned, but his long slender fingers, with the finely trimmed nails, said hide gun. On the back of his right hand was tattooed a dark black O. He was obviously uncomfortable in the dark suit he wore. Nate supposed it was because the gun beneath his coat was strapped down too tight. This man was a killer. "Afternoon, Congressman," Nate said. "I didn't know you were in town." "Well, hello. Nate, isn't it? Nate Carson." "Yes, sir." "Well, Nate, I've only just arrived. It seems this horrible tragedy has made us neighbors. I hope you'll excuse all the weaponry. I know it's not very neighborly, but Mr. Hargis here is concerned for my safety. He believes the murder of my family may have been an assassination attempt gone wrong. I was supposed to be here for a visit that day. However, I was detained in Little Rock on business and couldn't get here until last night. Now, he insists on an armed escort until we are back in Washington." "My sympathies for your loss, Congressman. Your father was a good friend." "Why, thank you, Nate. Will you be moving back to the Rockin' H?" "Oh, only on rare occasions when I can be away from Washington. However, I do hope to see the ranch be put to good use." "I heard Henry had a new barn going up down by the river. Are you planning to keep running cattle on the place?" "I really couldn't say just yet. Everything is still so unsettled. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm afraid I really must be going. I have an appointment with Sheriff Bryan today. Perhaps we will meet again soon." Perhaps we will. Take care, Congressman," Nate said. Nate touched the brim of his hat and wheeled Little Joe back onto the road as he leisurely paced down the road towards the Lazy L. And feeling uneasy, at the top of the next hill, Nate glanced back over his shoulder. Barely visible above the brow of the rise behind him one of Hotchkiss's drag riders watched him, no doubt making sure he was indeed riding home. "Not a very trusting sort, are they, Joe?" he asked. Jimmy dropped down on an empty chair next to his boss. "How'd it go, Captain?" he asked. "It depends on your point of view. I found out some things I guess we'll be interested in. Trouble is, I'm not sure that's a good thing." "And just what are those two up to anyway?" "Only what they told you, tracking down killers." "I still don't understand, Captain. Why the government hunting down ex-soldiers, even if they are murderers? Couldn't the sheriff or the Texas Rangers do that?" "Jimmy, believe me, you'll never see the end of this government's meddling in our private business. This time, though, it is a mess of the government's making. They open up the jails and let these killers loose. They're obliged to round them up again, but I'm sure they'd like to keep it all secret. Sheriff Bryan's a good man, but believe me, he's not prepared for what these men are chasing." "Hot damn, Captain. Are these men really that bad?" "Let's just say these men Jack and Nick are chasing are more like animals. Vicious animals than men. Let's just try and leave it at that, okay?" And the afternoon sun spread a warm blanket over the lazy L. Nate propped his boots on the porch rail and let himself relax. His gaze drifted to the north, where the grass-covered hills still wore the gold of summer. It didn't take long for his thoughts to turn to his guests. Jack and Nick ought to be back soon, he thought. Nate held to the faint hope that they would come back empty-handed and move on. Nate was a realist at heart, but he was also a man of hope. No harm in hoping for the best as long as you were prepared for the worst. Hope was like the grass. It was the staff of life in a land like this. A man needed hope to live. Hope that a rain would come. Hope that that rain would stop. Hope that a river would stay in its banks. So many hopes, and all of them beyond his control. Nate had seen his hopes stomped, burned, and washed down the river. But, like the grass, they grew right back. Nate owed his life to Jack Morgan on a hill outside Gettysburg. Jack Morgan had, literally, stepped between him and the jaws of death. And now, Jack wanted his help, and it was not in him to turn Jack away. Thoughts of Jack and the war conspired with the peaceful warm breeze and the restless night, and together they carried Nate's mind off into a sleep. He floated away from Texas and into the growing dark of the Pennsylvania countryside. Good God Almighty, he's turning into a wolf, Nate thought. Orville Pickens crouched beside him. A strangled whimper escaped the hardened veteran's lips. Nate saw the terror grow in Orville's eyes and knew what was coming. Orville was a soldier. He had met danger one of two ways: fight or retreat. And he was on his feet before Nate could stop him. Orville set off running down the hill, and a wolf charged from the trees enclosed on Orville. He had covered the last 2 yards with a leap and caught Orville by the arm. The impact sent the private rolling downhill. His arm, locked in the jaws of the wolf, came away at the shoulder. Orville's scream rose and fell as he tumbled, and the wolf shook the severed arm in its jaws. Blood from the severed arteries filled the air around the wolf's head with a fine red mist. And Nate could see the moon reflected in the blood covering Orville's chest. The wolf, tired of its prize, spat the arm to the ground. Orville was struggling to regain his feet, and he almost made it when the wolf hit him again. Nate vomited. The tall wolfman heard Nate retching and came towards him. Its lips rode back over the rows of sharp teeth. The damn thing just growled and kept coming when Nate leveled his bayonet at it. And for the first time in his life, Nate was too scared to think about shooting. The wolf sprang, and Nate buried his bayonet into the creature's chest. The beast's impact carried Nate to the ground and vaulted the skewered beast over his head and onto the grass beyond. Nate found he could breathe again, but his relief died quickly. The creature rose and pulled the bayonet from its chest and threw the weapon aside. And Nate decided the wolfman looked funny trying to walk upright on those crooked legs. It must have been funny because the thing was laughing as it came towards him. Now Nate wanted to run. He needed to run, but he could not move. The wolfman grabbed him by the front of his uniform, claws ripping through the coarse material, and the creature lifted Nate into the air. He saw the open jaws coming, and he knew he was going to die. Light flashed before his eyes, followed by thunder and the sound of ripping flesh. Nate fell. The pain in his shoulder testified that he was still alive, but Nate wasn't sure how that could be. Nate opened his eyes, and somehow they still worked. He rolled to relieve the throbbing in his shoulder, and Jack Morgan, bayonet in hand, stood over the bleeding creature. Jack had ripped the creature from jaw to... Nate leapt from sleep to wakefulness, carrying the memory with him. "Oh God," Nate whispered, "from jaw to ear." The sudden return of that memory was the end of hope harbored in the heart of Nate Carson. He had traveled 1,000 miles from the slaughter in Virginia, only to find he had not gone far enough. The killing and the killer followed him home. A drop of cold sweat tracked down his jaw, and Nate brushed it away and noticed Jimmy studying him. Nate smiled weakly. He wanted to tell Jimmy the whole truth about what they faced. The kid was entitled to know the truth, but Nate was determined not to tell him until he had to. Nate's reluctance was fueled by his discovery that he was scared. He hadn't been scared since that night at Gettysburg, and that fear stalked him now, made him madder than hell. Jimmy trusted him too damn much for him to give in to fear. "I'm hungry. Let's throw on some steaks," Nate said. As they rolled down Main Street, John Hotchkiss and his entourage drew the citizens of Texoma into their wake. Sam Bryan heard the commotion, knew what was coming, and resisted the urge to go see the big man from Washington. He busied himself with the papers on his desk and waited. Outside, Jason left his seat on the porch to open the door for Hotchkiss. "Morning, Congressman," Jason said. Hotchkiss nodded without looking at the deputy. Hotchkiss's bodyguard, Eamon Hargis, smirked at the deputy as he pushed through the door behind Hotchkiss. Hotchkiss halted his march in front of the sheriff's desk with a breathless huff, and Sam took his time. He flipped the pages in his hands one last time, looked up and dropped the papers and rose to shake hands with Hotchkiss. "Hello, Sam," the congressman said. "Congressman," Sam nodded. "My sympathies for your loss." "Mighty kind of you, Sam. Father was always fond of you." "Please, sit down," Sam offered. "Your father was a good man and a good friend. I want to thank you, Sheriff, for taking care of things for me until I could get here. I'm told it was a beautiful service, simple and straightforward, just as my father would have wanted. I was honored to help. I had the house cleaned up. There are probably things out of place. I don't think robbery was the motive, but I would appreciate you telling me if you find anything that is missing." "Of course, Sheriff. However, I'm afraid I wasn't a frequent visitor, so I may not know all the contents. As far as I can tell, nothing with any family history or any value seems to be gone." "What do you think was the motive, Sheriff?" Hargis asked. "Forgive me, Sheriff," Hotchkiss said. "This is Mr. Hargis, my chief of security." "Mr. Hargis, welcome to Texoma. To answer your question, damned if I know. Other than the general time they died, it's still all speculation at this point." "You know the congressman was scheduled to be here that day," Hargis said. So I've been told." "I think someone meant to kill the congressman during his visit. They must have gotten confused or mad when he wasn't there and took it out on the family." "I'm not ruling that out, but Why do you think that, Mr. Hotchkiss? Why would anybody around these parts want to hurt the Congressman or his family? It was Hotchkiss who answered. Sam, let's not be overly polite here. We all know my votes on a reconstruction haven't been popular here at home. My own father was angry with me. Not everyone wants the new peace or is willing to make the changes that it demands. The Klan is fading a bit throughout the South, but it remains especially strong here in Texas. One day they may grow powerful enough to vote one of their own into office. Until then, they're certainly not above assassination. They're nothing but a murderous bunch of riffraff. They are out to murder and terrorize law-abiding folks wherever they can. I'm certain they are behind all of this. I doubt there's any such people like that around here, Jason interrupted, and Sam shot Jason an angry look. Jason flushed and retreated out of the door. Forgive my deputy, Congressman, Sam said. He means well, he's just a little overeager and we're all a bit edgy. This was a horrible murder. The sight even frightened our undertaker. As you said, terror is the Klan's tool, and that idea has crossed my mind, but they have been tough to locate. You can be sure we will be looking into the possibility of Klan involvement. Thank you. Please, rest assured you have my full confidence, Sheriff. Now, I shall leave you to your work. You don't need the likes of me meddling in your business. I do have one last question, Congressman, if you don't mind. Of course not, Sam. Ask as many as you like. Do you know if your father or Henry made any trips to Whitesboro lately? Father? No, I can't imagine that. You know how he hates it there. I don't know of Henry going. Still, I suppose he could have. Why do you ask? I heard that there were a couple of murders in Whitesboro recently that had some similarity to what happened here. One victim was a man named Buckaloo and Underwood. Hotchkiss repeated the names. You know, Sheriff, I do know these men. They are a pair of slimy lowlife whiskey runners. I had the unpleasant task of defending them both in a criminal court. The charges for which I defended them had nothing to do with their sale of whiskey. However, their activities in that area were well known around the town. Father liked to tinker with whiskey making, but to think that he or my brother had anything to do with the likes of those two? Absolutely ludicrous. Who put that bug in your ear? No disrespect intended, Congressman. News of this sort gets around, and I had to look into it. I asked Sheriff Thurman about the cases, but he doesn't see a connection. And quite frankly, neither do I. I'm just doing the job I was hired to do, Congressman. I understand, Sam. No offense taken. For a moment you just sounded like a couple of pesky investigators that work for a committee I sit on back in Washington. Really? Yes, indeed. They're quite the pair. They're always pestering committee members with questions about conduct of the war. They actually work for a Pinkerton agency which is contracted to investigate threats against Reconstruction officials and assassination attempts, so I expect to see them here. They are a bit of a nuisance, but they are good at what they do. You haven't seen Jack Morgan or Nick Corbin in town yet, have you? No, I can't say I have, Congressman. Well, I'm sure you'll be seeing them before long. Would you let me know when they get here? I can do that. How long will you be in town, Congressman? I'm not sure yet. I need to get the estate settled while Congress is in recess. I could be here for a few weeks. I'll keep in touch. Hotchkiss rose and started for the door, and Sam saw him out of his carriage and watched him drive away. Let's talk, he told Jason. But the town of Texoma dropped out of the sight behind them, and John Hotchkiss ordered the driver to stop. This should do it, Humphreys, Hotchkiss called to the driver. He turned to his security man. Mr. Hotchkiss, I have a little job for you. I want you to go back to town and see this undertaker, Wentworth. I want to know why he was so spooked. Find out what he knows or thinks he knows. People in his line of work unusually so squeamish. You really think he suspects? No, not likely. But let's not take any unnecessary chances. Sam Bryan is lying and doing a mighty poor job of it. And Sheriff Thurman, he's an idiot. He wouldn't know a clue if he bit him in the ass. He knows even less about investigating murders. What the stupid fool does know is how to keep his mouth shut when he's told to. That little tidbit about Buckaloo and Underwood didn't fall into Bryan's lap by chance or come from Thurman. Morgan and Corbin are here somewhere, and they've been telling tales. Find them and find out who they've been talking to. What about Carson? Hotchkiss asked. Do you think he knows anything? Maybe. Why don't you ask him tonight? Hotchkiss said with a wink. Hotchkiss's broad smile stretched his face into an evil sneer, and Hotchkiss placed a hand on his arm. Only a brief appearance this time, that is, Hotchkiss said. First, go see that undertaker. Wow, 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 wow. Certainly another one. Wow. What an absolutely chest-pounding and riveting storyline coming along here from the incredible mind of my good friend Jack LaFountain. As you guys already know, I covered one of Jack's books already, entitled Bio Moon. You can check out that in my playlist under Jack LaFountain Stories. And also I'll leave a link to that if you want to treat yourself or a loved one to an incredible story for your collection. Lots and lots and lots of this storyline still to come out, a good few hours more. I will try to get those under my belt over the next few days and out to you guys as soon as possible. Of course, as ever, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag Team Fear and DMT's Cryptid Crew. As ever guys, I hope you're all well and happy, friends and family alike, and are trying to keep fit and focused as possible during these testing times. But above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.